I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, the controversy that's emerged in the aftermath of the passing of Fidel Castro. While many world leaders have paid tribute to Fidel Castro, including Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who said that he feels, quote, deep sorrow, quote, at Castro's passing. Many have been shocked and outraged that a man who spent his entire career as a brutal dictator, imprisoning, torturing, murdering thousands of his own people, would now be celebrated in any fashion at all. And this drama has played out on the American scene, where we've seen a stark contrast in foreign policy philosophy between the current Obama administration and the incoming Trump administration. President Obama, who has initiated the recent opening of U.S. relations with Cuba under current Cuban President Raul Castro, Fidel Castro's brother, the president offered his condolences to Fidel Castro's family, saying America's thoughts and prayers are with the Cuban people. The president also told the Cuban people that they must know they have a friend and partner in the United States of America. President-elect Trump's message read in part, "Today, the world marks the passing of a brutal dictator who oppressed his own people for nearly 6 decades. Fidel Castro's legacy is one of firing squads, theft, unimaginable suffering, poverty, and the denial of fundamental human rights." Trump then goes on to say, though the tragedies, deaths, and pain caused by Fidel Castro cannot be erased, our administration will do all it can to ensure the Cuban people can finally begin their journey toward prosperity and liberty. Well, what emotions do each statement evoke, not only among the Cuban people, but among Cuban Americans as well? And are you familiar with the fact that there are many Jews living in Cuba yet today, and that there's a term, Jubans, which refers to the Cubans of the Jews of Cuba? And it is interesting for us to learn more about how we here in the United States can understand what Cuban Jewish life is on that island. Well, one American Jew who was born in Havana, then came with her family to the United States when she was 4 years old, to then grow up in New York, is Ruth Behar, a professor of anthropology at the University of Michigan. And Ruth joins us on our JBS phones. Ruth, thank you so much for being with us on JBS.
Oh, thank you, Mark. It's a pleasure to get to talk to you about this.
Thank you. By the way, I told you off camera before the program began, you've written many pieces about Cuba and your own association with Cuba, but you wrote this marvelous piece about visiting Cuba a number of times and what it was like for you to go back to the home of your parents and grandparents. And if I'm not mistaken, Ruth, you have a Sephardic background in terms of the Cuban life that your family lived in Cuba, correct?
Yeah, well, I'm actually half and half. My father is Sephardic and my mother is Ashkenazi, so I'm a part of both traditions in Cuba and in the United States. Okay,
well, I was thrilled to be able to talk to you, not only talk about Fidel Castro and issues there, but also I'd love to, while I have you, to ask you a number of questions about the Cuban Jewish community. But first, I do want to know, how did you feel about Fidel Castro's death? How did your family feel?
Well, I received the news right around midnight on Friday, and interestingly, one of my friends, a writer who's now living in Mexico, let me know the news because it actually got to Mexico before it got to the United States. And I think my first reaction was, is this really true? Because there had been so many previous occasions when there were rumors of his death. So I think my first thought was, well, it's probably isn't true. And I think it's because so many of us have come to think of or thought of Fidel as almost eternal. It just seemed like he was always going to be around. So I think my first reaction was, it can't be true, and then my second reaction was shock. Oh my God, it is true. This is truly it. And he is mortal. You know, he tried to be a kind of god, or tried to convince himself that he was a kind of god, and it turned out he was mortal. And my parents were also up Friday night. We were in New York. We had gone to New York for Thanksgiving, and my mother had cooked a big Thanksgiving meal, a typical one, as she always does, a kind of mix of Cuban and American dishes. So we had black beans and rice, and we had tamales, but then we had turkey and, you know, all the other things, sweet potatoes. So she, you know, made this kind of Cuban Thanksgiving meal as always on Thursday, and then Friday my husband and I were with our son, who lives in New York, and the news came in kind of late, and everybody was asleep, but I was the only one awake, and I didn't want to wake them all up. So I was just kind of looking at the news, and then contacted my mother. My parents were up. And with my parents, it's been very interesting because they've kind of just been following all the news, and they've kind of been moved by everything. And just like me, like I'm very moved by, you know, the folks in Miami who've been celebrating, or were celebrating all weekend. There was something kind of, it was a celebration, but there was something so sad about it at the same time. And then there's all the grief, the outpouring of grief in Cuba, and people crying and paying their last respects to the ashes of Fidel Castro. So I think for me, and it's just typical of my position on Cuba, that I've tried to understand all the different perspectives and almost as if I could inhabit all these different positions, and I feel for everybody. Like, I feel for the Cubans in the U.S. who lost so much, like my parents and grandparents who lost everything in Cuba, plus those who suffered even more, who, you know, whose families, you know, died and were killed and so on. So I feel for those people, but I also feel for those people in Cuba that became revolutionaries and believed in the ideals that Fidel Castro espoused, and I've met many of those people, and they've lived with great sacrifice, and they've lived often, you know, lives of tremendous poverty and sacrifice, but all for this ideal of the revolution. So I kind of feel for everybody right now. I think it's a very emotional time, and I feel like a repository almost of all these different conflicting emotions.
Well, that's very beautifully said, and you're obviously a very lovely person, and you have a relationship, you know, with both people who live in Cuba and those who've come to live in America. I spoke, Ruth, to Alan Dershowitz, and what Alan Dershowitz said to us was, look, you have to understand, Fidel Castro was like Stalin. Whatever you would say to Stalin's family, however you would feel when Stalin died, that's really the appropriate emotion to feel when Fidel Castro died. And I want to understand, you're being awfully sweet to people who you're saying believed in Fidel Castro as if he represented something good for the Cuban people. And I've been seeing all kinds of descriptions of the life, and the poverty you describe was not poverty that needed to exist. People weren't sacrificing in poverty the way I read it, because ultimately there was some good coming out of that poverty. They were living in poverty because there was a dictatorial communist government that wouldn't let the country either be free, have free press, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, nor did they allow for economic prosperity, and that the poverty, and you write in your piece how even doctors are making $20 and $30 a week, and how you talk about how Jewish organizations in America were bringing in food and medicine, let alone Jewish memorabilia, you know, Jewish things, but they were bringing in the essentials of life to the Cuban Jews, the Cubans, because the regime under Fidel Castro did not allow for a flourishing, free, open society. And when I hear you say that there were Cubans who were weeping because Castro had died, it makes me think of the syndrome I hear when somebody is kidnapped and you live with your kidnappers long enough, you begin to identify with them and feel as if you're one with them. So against that backdrop, I need, Ruth, for you to clarify for me and for our audience what you feel, how you see the reality of Fidel Castro's regime and how he did or did not really bring suffering upon the Cuban people.
Well, I'm afraid that my perspective is just complex and ambivalent, and I wouldn't be able to respond as Alan Dershowitz has and tell people what the appropriate emotions should be at this time. That's not my way of approaching the world, maybe because I'm an anthropologist. I'm used to trying to understand all perspectives and respect them as best I can. But I don't feel that I can tell people what the appropriate emotion is. What I am seeing is a lot of genuine emotion that is conflicting. There are those who are celebrating, and there are those who are truly weeping. And I don't think everybody could be performing those emotions. I think those are real emotions, and I think it just speaks to the kind of figure that Fidel Castro was. He was a very polarizing figure. He was many things to many people. There were many who believed in him at the beginning, as my family did as well. In 59 and 60, most of the Cuban people believed in the ideals that he espoused of equality and redistributing wealth and education for everybody, health care for everybody. So there were these ideals that were very positive that he spoke for and represented, and I think those ideals were good ideals. On the other hand, I think that he then became an authoritarian leader and dictator, and what began as a very idealistic program very quickly became this authoritarian leadership. But nevertheless, I have seen in Cuba that many who were very, very poor are less poor now than they would have been under the previous system. They did bring about almost 100% literacy in Cuba. There has been good health care that now is, the whole system is falling apart now, but up until recently there's been good health care. I'm in touch with the woman who was my nanny as a child, a black Cuban woman who's now 91. And I have seen the doctor who who handles her neighborhood. I have seen him come and take care of her and do preventative medicine, and she's still healthy at the age of 91. So I have seen some things work in that system, but I also totally realize that yes, it's been an authoritarian government. And now the main change is that the economy is moving toward a mixed socialist capitalist system. That has happened under Raul in the last 10 years. And so some things are better. There's much more free enterprise than there was before. And even before Raul in the early 90s, there was an opening to religion. And freedom of religion is now practiced in Cuba. The synagogues are all open. They actually never closed during the heyday of the revolution, and the Jewish community has revitalized. So I can't say that it's all negative because I know people who live in Cuba, and I don't want to feel that they are living worthless lives. I think a lot of people did give up the possibility of living better in the United States or in another part of the world because they still believed in those ideals. There were people that were able or continue to be able to see the ideals of the revolution as something separate from the man Fidel Castro, who tried to make himself be the same as Cuba or the same as the revolution. But I think that there are many who are able to separate the leader that kind of took over those ideals and made them seem like they were the same as him, the person. And I think a lot of people still believe in the ideals and hope that they can be carried out in some way in the future while also moving forward towards a capitalist system that can make it possible for people to live at a higher standard of living than they do now.
Okay, but I want to make sure everyone understands. I have no need or interest to argue with you. I only want to understand. And what you say confuses me. So you just be patient with me.
No.
Okay.
No
So
worries.
I'm reading from your piece. Thousands of American Jews have gone to Cuba legally in groups organized by B'nai B'rith, synagogues, Hillels, JCCs, and museums. They bring medicine, food, clothing. Then I hear somebody say to me, there's a very high literacy rate in Cuba, and the healthcare is really good. If healthcare is good, why are these groups needing to bring medicine to Cuba?
I know. I've heard that question many times, and it is extremely contradictory. Cuba is an extremely contradictory place, and so they have extremely well-educated people who are lacking the basic supplies that are needed. And there are many reasons for it. There are those, of course, in Cuba who will say, well, it's because of the embargo. It's so difficult to get all the goods that they need. There's that. And then there's the fact that there is just tremendous mismanagement. And there is the fact that you mentioned as well, that it's a regime that continues to be very closed, that is very top-down, so everything is controlled, by the government, and if they could gradually let go, and as they have been, of many of the businesses, then people could manage them probably much better. And we've seen that in the tourist sector, where there's many private businesses now in the tourist sector. There are many new private restaurants, gourmet restaurants that are being written up in the New York Times, and those people are doing extremely well. And the government has kind of had to release the hold on the entire economy, because it became clear that they couldn't control everything. Even things like barbershops, had become controlled by the government. And, and a moment came when they said, what, we don't have to do everything. Let's let, barbers and, hairstylists have their own businesses. Let's allow more restaurants, private restaurants to exist. And so there are these areas where they have, let go of control. But you're right, it's very, very contradictory. It's very, very hard to explain, even after years of going to Cuba. It's true that they lack a lot of the basic things, but in terms of education, they do have excellent education on the teaching level, but on the level of management and supplies and goods, it's very chaotic, and that's why they continue to be very dependent on assistance from abroad. A lot of people, like people in my family, one of the things they always say to me is, well, when we lived in Cuba, we had everything we needed. You could get cornflakes in Cuba. You could get whatever you wanted in the 50s. And they, too, the same question you're asking me, they don't understand why is there such a lack of things. And, part of it is the socialist government-style mismanagement. Part of it is indeed corruption, and part of it is that Cuba has become more of a third world country. Since the United States stopped being in Cuba. Cuba was very, very developed throughout the first 50 years of the 20th century because the United States was actively involved. So everything worked, in a kind of American way with a sense of American efficiency and American prosperity. And all of that really got sapped out of Cuba after the Americans departed, with the revolution in the early 60s and imposed the embargo. And so Cuba, from an economic perspective, has just been, struggling to maintain itself, and has just essentially become much more of a third world country, comparable to other third world countries that you would see in Latin America as well.
Okay, I can understand a country being poor. And if that's what this is about, the fact that Fidel Castro was the president and now his brother is president, okay, so they were presidents over a poor country, and one can have enormous empathy for people who have to live in poverty, not because they're being oppressed, but because it's poverty. That's not what I understand. And again, I'll just press it one more time, because very often there's the old saw. Well, Stalin made the trains run on time. And if the trains ran on time under Stalin's rule, that didn't justify or make Stalin into a good guy. And you can tell me that what I read is wrong, because if it's wrong, it'll change, I think, all of our perceptions. But I'm reading that he imprisoned thousands of people, put people to death without trial, routinely, was brutal against his people, and that ultimately cut the Cuban economy in half. You're saying almost it was America's fault. I don't understand quite that. And that ultimately millions, literally millions of people who lived in Cuba fled the country because they did not want to live under Fidel Castro. This is before the country begins to fail economically. Your parents left. They brought you as a 4-year-old child. My sense is there's nothing about anything they saw in Cuba from the day they left, except, there may be some nostalgia for Cuban life and what Cuban Jewish life was like. And it's lovely to hear that your mother makes a Thanksgiving dinner and it's both somewhat American and somewhat Cuban. But it doesn't seem to me that your parents had any desire to move back to Cuba. And so my feeling is that while you are being really very lovely about this and you want to give everybody the right to their own emotions, and I am no way, that's lovely, I love it. I don't know that it is appropriate to sort of soften who Fidel Castro was when the history seems to read, Ruth, and then you tell me where the history is wrong. This guy was Stalin, he was Hitler, he was Mussolini. He represented the most repressive of rulers. And there are sometimes even communist systems that are not brutal. This seems to me to be brutal. If I'm wrong, explain it to me.
Well, I don't think you're wrong. And let me just to correct one thing. I mean, I didn't say it was America's fault that Cuba has become underdeveloped in the last few years. I just wanted to point out that while the United States was involved in Cuba's economy and culture, and the first 50, 60 years of the 20th century, Cuba functioned much more like a first world country because the United States was involved in Cuba. So I was just pointing that out. Really neutrally, not as good or bad, but just like the facts.
Are you
that's
critical?
Just like the way it was.
Are you critical that the United States withdrew its relations with Cuba?
No, I'm not critical.
Okay.
I mean, I think it had to be done at that time. I mean, I think that was that was the action that needed to be taken because the U.S. was concerned, and as you said, so many Cubans began to leave. In 1960, 1961, already people were fleeing because they were seeing the writing on the wall. There were, in fact, many of the Jews in Cuba said, well, this is like the Bolshevik Revolution again. They were seeing hints again of what they had experienced, in Russia. So it looked familiar to them, and it looked scary to them, and they didn't want to be part of it. And just, even in that early period, people could see already that the economy was changing. They were, putting forth the rationing system. There was already a shortage of supplies, beginning already in 60, 61. My mother tells a story that she had gone out to buy soap, and there was like a particular kind of soap that she liked, so she bought a large amount of it, and then she was stopped at the entrance to the building because there was a woman that was surveilling to see how much people were buying of different products, and that really scared her. She had been used to buying whatever she wanted, right? She was used to her economic freedom, and that was one of the things, that scared her. And from the Jewish perspective, what the Jews saw that doesn't have to do with the economy, but has to do with cultural and social life, what they saw was that yes, Cuba was putting forth this idea of literacy, which was great. Yes, everybody should be able to read, but at the same time, they were on the verge. They hadn't done it yet in '61, but they were on the verge of closing down all the private and parochial schools, which meant that Jewish people wouldn't be able to send their children to Jewish day schools. I myself, got to go to a Jewish day school in Cuba for about a year or half a year before we left Cuba. So that was very scary to the Jewish community. The synagogues never closed down, but then it moved to become an atheist system where you couldn't practice religion, not Judaism in particular, but no religion could be practiced openly because it really sacrificed your chances of moving ahead in Cuban society, getting an education, and so on. So those restrictions of freedom were what people began to see in the early 60s, in that first wave, that first big wave of migration. And you're right, 20% of the Cuban people live outside of Cuba. That is a very, very big number of people. There are 11 million Cubans on the island and 2 million living outside of the island. So that is a very, very big community. And what happened, and what we have to understand, is that Cubans that were disaffected with the revolution knew that they could come to the United States. And so the United States was kind of always there to receive those who dissented with Cuba. And so it became literally impossible to express any dissent on the island. And the one way you could express your dissent was basically to leave the island. And that became the common thing up to the present in many ways. Though now we also have many Cubans that don't want to be in the polarized dynamics of Cuba and the U.S., and so many choose to live in Europe or choose to live in Latin America so that they're not caught within this polarized situation of Cuba and U.S. relations, or at least how they were up until President Obama restored relations with Cuba, which, by the way, I think is a very positive thing, because what I've been trying to say, and I'm not sure I've been able to make myself clear, is that my concern is with the Cuban people, and I want what's best for the Cuban people. And, in all my trips to Cuba, I was always very afraid, in fact, that I would be there when Fidel Castro died, because in my mind, since I left as a child and I heard so much about Fidel Castro when I was growing up and had so much fear of him because of everything that my family told me, so every time I would go back to Cuba, I was always concerned that, that something terrible would happen, that he would die, and that, that literally the earth would open up and swallow me. I was just so terrified of that, and it just so happened that I wasn't there when he died. But I think it's that he was very brutal in many ways, but he also acquired, a kind of mythical quality in the minds of many of us, and I think we gave him, in our minds, sometimes even more power than he actually had, even though he did, in fact, have a lot of power. Again, as an anthropologist, I'm trying to understand as many different perspectives as I can. And, it's interesting that the Canadians have a very different perspective. The South Africans have a different perspective. And so Fidel Castro was able to show different sides of himself, to different countries and to different people. And, I think we just have to kind of accept the truth of that, even if we might disagree with it.
Again, you are so lovely and thoughtful, and it's lovely that you give me some time. We never got to speak about the Cubans. I hope you'll let me call you back, and we'll just talk a little bit about what did it mean for you to grow up first even 4 years as a little Jewish girl in Cuba, and what is the experience of the Cuban Jewish community. So I hope you'll let me call you again. And in the meantime,
absolutely.
I thank you so much for the time, and I wish you all the best, and we'll talk soon.
Okay. Thank you so much, Mark. It was a pleasure.
Very much appreciated. The thoughts of Ruth Behar, a professor of anthropology at the University of Michigan. My thanks, as always, to Sloan Copeland, Serge Goldberg, Dara Golub, and the producer of In the News, Carol Lilienthal. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.